Hey there. Tonight, we're going back, not to kings or crusades, but to crumbling villages, candlelit chapels, and the quiet grip of a church that shaped every breath you took. You'll live the life of a medieval peasant, born beneath a cross, taught to fear hell before you could spell it, and guided through life by priests, saints, relics, and rules that seem to change with the wind. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe. But only if it truly brings you some peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something oddly comforting about seeing who else is falling asleep to the same old story. If you'd like to support this work and listen without ads, there's a Patreon link down in the description. It helps keep the incense burning and the stories coming. So, dim the lights, let the night settle, pull the blanket close, and let's begin. With a baby, a priest, and a splash of holy water. The room is dark, damp, and smaller than a stable. The air smells of soot, sweat, and something vaguely sour, a scent that clings to damp wool and tired skin. You don't remember the moment you're born. No one ever does. But you're told it happened quickly. Your mother screamed, your father paced, and the village midwife muttered prayers over your slippery head as she coaxed you into the world by candlelight. You arrive into a world already claimed by the church. Before your eyes can properly see, before your tiny mouth can form its first blasphemy, the priest is summoned. He's an old man with bowed legs, coarse fingers, and a fondness for ale and authority. He grumbles about the early hour, but arrives anyway, as he always does. Your parents know the rules. Infants must be baptized as soon as possible. The soul, they say, must not spend a single day outside the grace of God. The threat of limbo hangs like fog over the thatched roof. Water is drawn, cold, probably a bit dirty, and the priest traces the sign of the cross on your forehead. He mumbles Latin you don't understand and pours holy water over your scalp. It's more of a splash than a sprinkle. You cry. Everyone relaxes. That's a good sign. The priest declares your soul now belongs to God. Your mother clutches you, exhausted, while your father thanks the priest with a coin he can't afford to give. Just like that, you're no longer simply a child. You're a Catholic. The rite of baptism isn't optional in your world. It is the first ritual in a long string of obligations. The first link in the lifelong chain the church wraps around you, link by link, ceremony by ceremony. Without baptism, you are nothing. Worse than nothing. You are unsaved, unprotected, unacceptable. Should you die unbaptized, even before you've had the chance to sin, you'd be sent to a place neither heaven nor hell. A theological waiting room where souls simply linger. No one understands limbo fully, but everyone fears it. And in a village where death visits often and without warning, from fever, famine, or the wrong mushroom, there's no room for uncertainty. So you're baptized before your mother can even walk across the room. Your soul is washed clean before you ever had the chance to dirty it. They even pick your name from the saint's calendar. You weren't going to be named after your grandfather no matter what he thought. Your godparents stand behind you during the rite, looking solemn and mildly confused. Their duties are unclear but spiritually binding. Should your parents die, not unlikely given the mortality statistics, your godparents are expected to raise you in the faith. Not feed you or clothe you necessarily, but make sure you keep going to church. You wonder later in life if they'd have done it. Maybe. If the crops were good that year. As you grow, you notice that the church is not simply part of village life. It is village life. Its bell tolls set the rhythm of your days. Its calendar dictates when you can feast and when you must fast. Its priests are the only literate men in a world where even the local lord signs his name with a shaky X. The church knows what happens to your soul, how to cleanse it, how to charge for the cleansing, and exactly how guilty you ought to feel about everything. The wooden crucifix in your family's cottage looms large. Jesus, nailed, bleeding, sombre, watches your every movement from above the hearth. No one ever explains why the Son of God must always look like he's having a particularly rough afternoon. But the message is clear. Someone suffered for your sins, even if you haven't committed any yet. You learn early that guilt is a kind of inheritance. Like the family goat, it's just handed down whether you want it or not. When you begin to speak, your mother teaches you the Lord's Prayer before she teaches you to count. You learn it by rhythm, not meaning. You mumble it with your hands clasped and your eyes squinting, hoping the effort alone counts. Latin phrases are everywhere, carved into the church walls, muttered by the priest, embroidered into altar cloths. But you don't know what they mean. It's God's language, you're told, which means you're better off not understanding it. The first time you step into the church, you're too young to remember it. Your parents carry you in, freshly baptized, wrapped in linen, a spiritual receipt in your soul. But the first time you really remember going is on a cold morning, when the village fog hangs thick and your stomach is empty. The stone church is cold, the benches are hard, and the priest is somehow both quiet and long-winded. You sit still because you're supposed to, because God is watching, or because your father is. The church itself is the only stone building in the village. It smells of beeswax, mildew, and centuries of whispered fears. There are painted walls you can't read, and wooden statues that seem to stare back. Somewhere near the front, there's a carved scene of the Last Judgment, sinners tumbling into a monstrous mouth full of teeth and fire. You're too young to understand, but not too young to be scared. That's the point. The priest tells your father that fear of hell is healthy for children. It keeps them good. You wonder what kind of child needs nightmares to behave. Then again, you once tried to steal an apple from the Lord's orchard and tripped into the mud before you got 2 steps. Maybe God pushed you. As you begin to age, all of 5 or 6 winters, you start noticing more. The bells that signal Mass, the hush that falls when the priest enters, the way your parents stiffen when his gaze lands on them, the quiet mutter of penance after communion, whispered like someone's trying to fold a secret in half, and always, always the reminder that the church brought you into this world and will be there to usher you out. Even the days of rest are his. Sunday is not for lounging. It's for Mass, for kneeling, for long readings in a language no one in your family speaks. You learn the patterns anyway. When to sit, when to bow, when to look like you're praying, even if you're just wondering what's for supper. A small grumbling part of you wonders why heaven requires so many rehearsals. By the time you're old enough to do chores without supervision, you've already learned that God is everywhere. He's in the storms that drown the barley, in the silence after your mother coughs, and in the eyes of the priest who never blinks long enough. You hear whispers of saints and demons, relics and sins, indulgences and miracles. You don't understand most of it, but you don't question it either. That's what gets people burned. Still, there are moments of comfort. The way candlelight flickers against the stone walls. The soft chant of a hymn you don't know but feel anyway. The smell of bread at Easter Mass. The small mercy of being reminded, once in a while, that not everything sacred is terrifying. Some of it is just quiet, and kind, and warm. But those moments are rare. Most days, the church feels more like a gatekeeper than a shepherd. You are born into its arms, but also its grip. You begin to sense, even as a child, that this isn't a place you enter. It's a place that never leaves you. Baptism may have saved your soul, but it also marked you. A mark that says, you belong to us, forever. And when the priest looks at you during Sunday service, eyes unreadable beneath his drooping brow, you believe it. They say the soul is light as breath. But from the moment yours was dipped in holy water, it's carried a certain weight. Not evil, not cruel, just constant. A low pressure on the chest, a slow whisper in the ear. The church will guide you, judge you, punish you, and praise you, all in equal measure, and all from the moment you entered the world, born with nothing, baptized with water, owned by God. It begins with a mural. You're barely tall enough to see over the pew when your eyes first catch the twisted mass of bodies, flames, and teeth. Painted high on the wall, right above the altar, is a great gaping mouth, open wide, impossibly wide, with jagged yellow fangs stretching into shadows. Inside the mouth are people, hundreds of them, naked, screaming, clutching at each other, tumbling into the throat of a beast you've never seen in nature, but understand instinctively. This is what waits if you misbehave. Welcome to church. You tug on your mother's sleeve. She doesn't look. Everyone's facing forward. The priest's voice drones in Latin, a language that means something to God and absolutely nothing to you. But the painting makes its point without translation. Hell is real. It has a mouth, and you are precisely the right size to fit inside it. From that moment on, you see signs of damnation everywhere, in stone carvings, in stained glass, in wooden statues that seem to glare at you even when your eyes are shut. One particularly horrifying window shows a man being spit roasted by demons, who look as though they're enjoying their work far too much. Another sculpture near the door shows a soul being weighed against a feather, with a scowling devil ready to pounce should things go poorly. You've never felt so heavy in your life. Fear, you quickly learn, is part of the service. Hell isn't just a place, and it's a presence, a looming possibility, a word that makes grown men flinch and children sleep with one eye open. The priest doesn't avoid the subject. In fact, he rather enjoys it. He preaches of it regularly, painting pictures with his voice that rival the frescoes in detail. Fire that doesn't consume, pain that never ends, worms that feast forever. Eternal suffering. All because you coveted your neighbour's goat or rolled your eyes at your mother's stew. You start keeping a mental list of your sins. It grows quickly. The church teaches that even thoughts can condemn you. A wicked idea, no matter how brief or harmless, stains the soul. So when you catch yourself daydreaming during Mass, or muttering under your breath when you're told to scrub the floor again, you panic. You begin to confess things you're not even sure are sins, just to be safe. Once, you admitted to feeling annoyed when your sister chewed too loudly. The priest raised an eyebrow and added an extra prayer, just in case. Children in the village whisper about hell as though it's a neighbour who lives just beyond the woods. They share stories in low voices, of gluttons who are force-fed molten gold, of liars whose tongues are nailed to tables, of thieves who are buried alive in pits of ash. You aren't sure which stories come from Scripture and which from someone's older cousin, but it hardly matters. The images are sticky. They follow you into your sleep. And when you dream of fire. On feast days, mystery plays are performed in the village square. These are supposed to be educational, uplifting even. But somehow, they always end with someone being dragged to hell by a man in red robes and a mask with horns. The devil in these plays is often the best actor. He struts, he grins, he sings. He's the only one who seems to be having any fun. Until, of course, he drags a merchant or a wayward nun into a painted pit, and the crowd gasps and clutches their crosses. You do too. Every time. One year, a player collapsed mid-performance. Heat stroke, someone said, and the rumour spread that it was divine punishment. He had mocked the devil too convincingly. The priest didn't confirm or deny it, which, as you've learned, is his favourite way to say yes. The worst part is how normal it all feels after a while. Hell becomes background noise, part of the rhythm of life, like frost in winter or blisters in summer. You accept it the way you accept the Lord's taxes or the smell of damp straw. Of course there's a hell. Of course it's full of flames and teeth and regrets. Of course it's waiting. What else would be at the end of such a hard life? And yet, amid the fear, there's a strange comfort in the certainty of it all. The rules are clear. Obey, confess, tithe, fast, stay in line, keep your soul clean, or at least scrubbed semi-regularly. The path is narrow, the priest says, but it leads to heaven. And if you wander, well, the mouth is still open. You start to notice the economics of damnation. There's a price for nearly everything. Sins can be absolved, time in purgatory shortened, eternal fire postponed, all for the right donation. Indulgences, they're called. Forgiveness, available for purchase. The wealthier villagers clutch parchment certificates, declaring their sins absolved in advance. You've seen one man smile with relief after paying for a sin he hasn't even committed yet. That, you think, is planning ahead. Your family can't afford such luxuries. You give what you can. Eggs, a length of twine, once even your father's belt. The priest accepts each offering with solemn gratitude, then gently remind you that salvation is a lifelong process, not a one-time transaction. You nod, ashamed, and wonder whether anyone in your house has ever truly been forgiven. The fear sharpens with age. As you grow older, you understand more of the sermons, and they only deepen the dread. Eternal torment, outer darkness, wailing and gnashing of teeth. One day you ask your mother what gnashing means. She demonstrates by clenching her jaw and grinding her teeth slowly. You don't ask again. Punishments, you notice, are tailored. The lazy are made to labour forever. The proud are broken, the impure are exposed. Every sin has its poetic inverse. Every weakness becomes a weapon. It's almost elegant, almost beautiful, almost. Even your surroundings seem built to remind you of judgment. Gargoyles leer from the church roof, their twisted faces frozen mid-scream. The stone floor is always just a little too cold. The incense, sweet as it is, masks something older, a scent of wax and bone and centuries of confession. And then there's the painting. Always the painting. No matter where you sit, that mouth is there, waiting. Once, in a moment of rare honesty, you ask your father if he believes in all of it, the fire, the demons, the eternal part. He doesn't answer at first, just stares into the fire. Then he says, "It doesn't matter whether it's real. What matters is that we believe it is." You don't ask again. The priest says that fear is the beginning of wisdom, that hell is a kindness, really, a warning, a guide, a motivator, that without it people would sin freely, that with it we can be shaped into holy vessels. You look around at the people in your village, hollow-eyed, bent-backed, praying harder than they speak, and wonder what kind of vessels they've become. There are moments when you feel brave, when the sun is warm and the bread is fresh, and the meadow smells like thyme, when you laugh with your sister or hear bird song echo through the trees. You think, in those moments, that maybe hell isn't real, that maybe it's just a story to keep peasants pliant and children scared, but the feeling never lasts. A sermon, a shadow, a cold gust of wind, and the doubt melts away. You kneel again, you cross yourself again, you whisper your prayers in the dark, careful to include even the small sins, just in case, because hell is a place of fire, because hell is a place of truth, because hell is the one thing you are sure is listening. And if it's not real, well, the fear still works just fine. You learn to give before you learn to speak. It starts with the clink of a coin in a wooden bowl, your mother's hand shaking slightly as she parts with the only spare penny in the cottage. You're too young to understand what the offering is for. You think maybe it's a toll, like the one at the bridge, or payment for using the church's fire. It isn't until years later that someone explains, the church needs it. For candles, for wine, for your soul. Of course, your soul never asked for any of these things, but it's apparently the sort of guest who racks up a bill without mentioning it. Every Sunday, the bowl goes around. Sometimes it's a basket, sometimes a box. It doesn't matter. It comes to you all the same, slow, expectant, quiet as a tax collector with good posture. Everyone sees what you give, and what you don't. The shame of an empty hand, even when your pockets are empty too, is its own kind of punishment. They call it a tithe, a holy duty. 1/10 of everything you have, or as close as you can manage without starving. Livestock, grain, a sack of onions, it all counts. The local reeve keeps track of who's generous and who's merely obedient. Generosity, in this case, is defined by how uncomfortable the donation makes you. If your pantry still looks respectable afterward, you didn't give enough. You come to understand that poverty doesn't exempt you, it brands you. The poor must give not in abundance, but in proportion to their lack. A rich man who gives a silver coin is admired. A poor man who gives his last turnip is considered saintly. Your family has learned to aim for something in between, respected but not canonized. Saints don't eat very well. The church doesn't just collect tithes, though. There are special contributions, penance payments, alms for the poor, alms for the monks, alms for the poor monks, collections for rebuilding the church roof, collections for painting a new Virgin Mary, collections for cleaning the old Virgin Mary. Every spiritual concern seems to have a matching fee. You suspect someone is keeping a very long tab. It doesn't stop at the doors of the church. When your uncle dies, your family is expected to offer a soul fee, a few coins paid to the priest to ensure his safe passage through purgatory. It's not mandatory, exactly, but no one wants to see what happens to an unpaid soul. The priest's prayers come slower when there's no silver on the altar. Later, when your cousin gets married, there's a fee for that too. A blessing doesn't come cheap. Love may be free, but the sacrament of holy matrimony costs exactly 6pence and a chicken. And then there are indulgences. You hear the word for the first time while eavesdropping onto older villagers near the well. They speak of parchment, wax seals, and a promise that sounds too good to be true. Sins forgiven in exchange for coin. It sounds like something a market huckster would shout from behind a cart, but when you ask the priest, he nods solemnly. Yes, he says. The Church, through its infinite mercy, offers forgiveness for donations of sufficient sincerity. And if your sincerity happens to be measured in shillings, well, who are we to question divine arithmetic? Indulgences become a quiet obsession in the village. People speak of them with envy and awe. A neighbour shows off his parchment like it's a relic, a declaration that his recent anger, gluttony, and unspecified travel behaviour are now forgiven. You can't read the Latin, but the seal looks official. He walks taller afterward. Your family cannot afford indulgences, but your father tries once, after a particularly severe illness, one that leaves him pale and shaking for days. He stumbles into the church with half a sack of barley and a carved token meant to resemble St. Cuthbert, though it mostly resembles a badger. The priest is polite. The offering is accepted. Your father says he feels lighter. He doesn't specify whether he means spiritually or because he gave away half his winter storage. You begin to grasp the logic. Guilt is a currency. Fear is an investment. And salvation is not unlike a transaction at the market. Everyone pays. The rich pay visibly. The poor pay painfully. The Church also knows how to sweeten the deal. Once, a friar comes to your village selling relics. A splinter of the true cross, a scrap of the Virgin's veil, a bone that may or may not have belonged to St. Peter's donkey. Each comes with a price. Each promises blessings. People gather to touch them, to kneel, to murmur prayers. One woman weeps openly while holding what she's told is a vial of Christ's breath. You're not sure how one bottles a breath, but no one dares ask. The friar leaves 3 days later with a full satchel and a fresh horse. Even children aren't spared. You're taught from a young age to give what you can. A small coin, a portion of your bread, an hour of labour sweeping the church steps. It's good for your soul, they say. It builds character. And besides, you're lucky. Some children are given to the church, permanently. There's a family in your village who gave up their 3rd son to the monastery. Couldn't feed him, couldn't keep him. Now he's clean, fed, and reportedly very good at Latin. His mother cries every feast day. His father never speaks of it. When you pass the monastery on long walks, you glance at the walls and wonder if he thinks about the fields he left behind. Once, you ask the priest what the church does with all the things it collects. He smiles and gestures vaguely toward heaven. The Lord keeps accounts, he says. You nod, unsure whether that's a metaphor or an administrative procedure. Either way, the ledger seems to grow longer by the day. The church reminds you often that this life is temporary. That comfort now may cost you later. that it is better to suffer in this world than the next. It's a hard thing to hear when your boots are leaking and your stomach groans like a dying cow. But it's also oddly motivating. Misery becomes noble. Hunger becomes holy. And generosity, even if born from fear, is treated like virtue. Still, there are moments when the burden feels absurd. Like the time your mother dropped a coin meant for the offering plate and it rolled under the pew. She spent the entire Mass on her knees, not in prayer, but trying to reach it without drawing attention. She got it back eventually. It was given, polished with sleeve, with a trembling hand and an apology. You've never seen her look more devout. Or the time a neighbour brought an offering of eggs, only to have one break in the basket. The smell during communion was memorable. The priest insisted it was a lesson in humility. Others suggested the lesson was in reinforcing your baskets. Another time, the village baker attempted to give loaves made from last year's flour. The priest accepted them, but later reminded the congregation that the Lord prefers first fruits. The baker never made that mistake again. His next donation was fresh, soft, and notably missing from the shop shelves. There's humour in all of this, if only because the alternative is weeping. A sort of grim laughter shared among villagers who know the game is rigged but play it anyway. The church is the only path to salvation, and that path is lined with toll booths. You don't complain, you pay, you nod, you hope, because one day it will be your funeral. Your soul will hover, uncertain, and someone will stand at the altar with a coin in hand, a last payment, a final bribe, and you'd like that person to have something to offer, even if it means going hungry now, even if it means handing over your last hen, your last hope, your last bit of pride. Because when heaven's gate is locked, you pray it's not your name that's missing from the guest list, but the donation. And you pray most of all that God accepts credit. You are 7 when you first shuffle into the dark wooden box at the side of the church. You've never been inside it before, but you've seen others go, and you've seen how they emerge after, quiet and small, eyes cast down, sometimes red-eyed, sometimes oddly peaceful. No one explains what you're meant to do, not properly, but it's your turn now. So in you go. The priest's voice seeps through the wooden lattice like wind through a cracked shutter. Speak, my child. You freeze. The silence stretches. Then you mumble something about stealing an egg, even though you're not sure you did. Maybe you thought about it. Or maybe you just watched someone else do it and didn't speak up. Either way, it's the best you've got. He sighs, long and low, and tells you to say 3 paternosters, 2 Ave Marias, and try not to let temptation win next time. You nod, even though he can't see you, and stumble out into the church's main hall, blinking as if you've emerged from a cave. Thus begins a lifetime of confession. You learn quickly that confession isn't just for murderers and thieves. It's for everyone. Everyone sins. Even when they don't mean to. Even when they don't understand how. You've heard that failing to fast properly on a feast day is a sin. Missing church is a sin. Speaking harshly to your mother is a sin. Thinking lustfully about the thatch roof girl with the crooked teeth might be the worst sin of all. And so you confess, week after week, sometimes with conviction, sometimes with imagination. Your village isn't particularly sinful, if you measure it by violence or crime. But by church standards, it's positively writhing with corruption. Old Jorik the smith grumbles about indulgences again and again, but he still lines up with the rest of you for weekly penance. Ellen, the brewer's daughter, is in there so often you wonder if she rents space in the confessional. You once saw your father walk in looking stern and walk out looking hollow, like something had been wrung out of him behind that little screen. You're not supposed to talk about what's said in there, but everyone gossips anyway, and everyone lies, just a little. No one admits it, of course, but you know it happens. How could it not? Who wants to admit to envying a neighbour's plough? Who wants to say aloud they touched themselves beneath the hay when they were supposed to be hauling water? You once tried to confess a dream. You weren't sure it was a sin, but it felt like one. The priest told you dreams don't count unless you enjoy them too much. You're still not sure what that means. By the time you're old enough to understand Latin phrases and church teachings, at least the ones the priest decides are fit for a peasant's ears, you realise that confession isn't really about telling your sins. It's about feeling them. Regret, shame, guilt. These are the tools with which your soul is chipped into shape. The priest is just the sculptor. Or perhaps more accurately, the man who collects the chisel marks and reports them back to God. The confessional itself becomes oddly comforting. It's one of the few places in your life where you can speak without interruption, without judgment, or so they say. Though you often feel judged by the creak of the bench or the way the priest clears his throat when you admit something mildly scandalous. There was the time you said you harboured dark thoughts about kicking your neighbour's goose. The priest paused so long you thought he might call for backup. You begin to notice patterns. Some sins are met with a gentle nod and a quick penance. Pride, laziness, forgetting to say grace before supper. Others, like envy or impure thoughts, earn a slower voice, a more solemn tone, and sometimes a lecture. Anything to do with lust is treated as though it personally offended the Virgin Mary herself. And then there are the sins you didn't even know were sins until someone else got punished for them. Gossiping during Mass. Using the Lord's name while chasing a runaway pig. Missing a fast day because you didn't know it was a fast day. Each mistake is a reminder. The Church keeps the rule book, and it's updated regularly. Sometimes you run out of things to confess. It's a quiet week. No one's died, no one's fought. You haven't stolen or lusted or lied. And so you start inventing small things. You claim you were impatient with your sister. You muttered something rude about a local monk. Once, you confessed to taking more than your share of pottage, even though you gave half to a dog with sad eyes. Better to confess something than nothing. Better to appear sinful than to risk appearing arrogant. That too is a sin. Over time, your relationship with confession becomes complicated. You wonder how the priest knows what sins are truly worthy of fear and which are merely frowned upon. You wonder what he does with all that knowledge. Does he forget it instantly, wiping it away like dust on a windowsill? Or does he store it, stacking each whispered guilt in neat little piles inside his mind? You know he's just a man. You've seen him nod off during homilies. You've seen his boots patched with leather like everyone else's. Once, you saw him drinking ale behind the sacristy, cheeks pink and eyes glazed, and you wondered if he had someone to confess to. Sometimes the confessional smells of beeswax and incense. Other times it smells of sweat and damp wool. Always it smells like something old and private, like a place too used to secrets. You hear rumours of public confession in bigger towns, of sinners kneeling before whole congregations, sobbing their sins to rows of judgmental eyes. You thank whatever saint looks after small villages that yours doesn't practice such humiliation. Not yet, at least. When you're older, you learn about penance that isn't just prayers. There are stories of men forced to crawl on hands and knees to the altar, of women forbidden from speaking for a week, of entire families made to give up a prized pig to atone for a single misdeed. The weight of sin, it seems, can be measured in livestock as well as sorrow. And yet, despite all this, the shame, the guessing games, the occasional creative embellishments, you keep going. Every week, every season, every year. Because no matter how tiresome it gets, no matter how repetitive or surreal or uncomfortable it feels to murmur a litany of personal failings into the ear of a man who once farted during Vespers, you're afraid not to. Because if you stop confessing, your sins will pile up. And if they pile up too high, they'll drag your soul down. That's what you're told. That's what you believe. And maybe, just maybe, there's comfort in the ritual. In knowing that no matter how muddy your boots, how flawed your thoughts, how foolish your heart, there's always a booth waiting and a man behind a screen who'll offer you a few words, a few prayers, and a chance to try again. Even if you're not sure what you did wrong in the first place, the miracle begins, as many do, with a whisper. You're out mending the fence that barely keeps the goats from eating your neighbour's turnips when word spreads. The statue of the Virgin in the chapel down the road has wept. Not just moisture, tears. Real tears, they say. Wet, glistening, human tears rolling down her cheek. You pause, squinting into the sun. Is it true? Does it matter? You feel your legs begin to walk before your mind catches up. In a village with few excitements and even fewer diversions, a weeping statue is cause for a pilgrimage, even if that pilgrimage is only half a mile. By the time you arrive, the chapel is crowded. Everyone seems to be leaning inward, craning necks, stepping on each other's toes for a glimpse of the miraculous. The air smells of hay, breath, and incense. Someone's lit a furrable, swinging smoke, like it'll help make sense of it all. You can't get close enough to see the tears yourself. A man swears they've dried up. A woman says she saw them with her own eyes, clear as spring water. Someone else says they weren't tears but blood. Another insists it was oil, sweet and fragrant like pressed olives from the Holy Land. The statue just stands there, as stony and unbothered as ever. Still, a miracle is a miracle. Whether you saw it or not hardly matters. The priest is already speaking about how it's a sign, a warning perhaps of sin in the village, or maybe a blessing for the faithful who've remained pure. It depends on the sermon. It always does. Miracles, you find, are rarely convenient things. They tend to arrive when people are already hungry, or tired, or busy. They demand attention, devotion, a bit of coin for the poor box, and sometimes a candle you can barely afford. But no one dares question them aloud. That would be impious, disrespectful, dangerous even. And yet, inside you, the doubt creeps in like a draught through the chapel door. The church has always traded in the wondrous. From saints who levitate to relics that glow, medieval Christendom was built on more than just scripture. It was built on spectacle. In an age where literacy was rare and science was indistinguishable from sorcery, these wonders were not only believed, but expected. You remember your uncle swearing that St. Margaret once helped his cow give birth after a desperate prayer. He said he saw a glowing light in the barn, right above the hay, and then, miracle of miracles, the calf slid out, healthy and bawling. You also remember your uncle was drunk for most of Lent, but even the sober speak of such things, of saints who bled for the sins of others, of monks who healed with a touch, of bones that never decayed. The stories grow with each telling, details added like seasoning to pottage, just enough to make them palatable. You once saw a traveller arrive with a splinter of the true cross. He kept it in a little glass tube, sealed with wax and surrounded by gold filigree. He said it came from Rome, and that the Pope himself had blessed it. For a small donation, you could kiss it and receive a full indulgence from minor sins. A few women wept. One man fainted. You gave 2 pennies and tried not to think too hard about where one might find that many splinters of a single cross. The relic trade is booming, or so they say. Every church wants one. A sliver of bone, a drop of blood, a sandal worn by a saint, a tooth, a finger, even a feather from the angel Gabriel himself. Some relics sit in fine reliquaries of silver and gold. Others are wrapped in cloth and kept in locked boxes, only brought out on feast days. You once queued for 3 hours to see the severed hand of St. Alban. It looked suspiciously like a chicken wing, but no one said so. Miracles, of course, are good for business. They draw crowds. Crowds bring offerings. Offerings mean candles are lit, incense burned, and the coffers of the church jingle with a bit more weight. A weeping statue here, a healing spring there. It all feeds the machine of faith. But there's a deeper reason the church needs miracles. You see, they're proof. Tangible evidence that heaven still watches, still intervenes, still punishes and forgives. For people like you, who live in a world of mud and toil, who bury half their children before they can walk, who bleed and sweat and break, miracles are hope. Shaky, flickering hope, like the flame of a votive candle in a wind-blown chapel. And so you learn not to ask questions. Not out loud, not in front of the priest. Certainly not near the bishop. You nod solemnly when a tale is told. You make the sign of the cross. You whisper your prayer. And if your eyes drift to the statue's dry cheeks, and your mind wonders whether it ever truly wept, you scold yourself and look away. Sometimes, at night, you stare at the ceiling of your hovel and think about St. Cuthbert, who was said to have turned back the sea with his staff, or St. Julian, who cured a man of leprosy with a kiss. You think about the girl from 2 villages over who claimed the Virgin appeared to her in the forest and gave her a silver coin. You think about whether it matters if the stories are true, if the results are the same. Because faith, you learn, is a kind of bargain. You give your trust, your labour, your coin, your children. In return, the church gives you meaning, structure, a path to heaven, and the occasional miracle to reassure you that it's all real, that your suffering isn't wasted, that someone, somewhere, sees you. Once, during a particularly bad year, the crops rotted, the rain came late, and your cousin died of something that made his skin blacken. You saw another miracle, or thought you did. A bird flew into the chapel during Mass, circled the altar, and then vanished. Vanished, not out the window or through the door, but right in mid-air. That's what you told yourself. That's what others said too. The priest claimed it was a sign from God. A good one, he said, and then he asked for donations. You gave a copper penny and a sideways glance. Later, while hauling water, you confessed to your neighbour that you weren't sure the bird vanished. Maybe it had flown into the rafters. Maybe you were imagining things. He didn't respond. Just gave you a look. A very particular look. And you realised it was better to keep such thoughts to yourself. Not long after, that same neighbour came down with a fever. His wife swore she saw St. Michael standing at the foot of his bed, sword drawn. He recovered. Slowly, but he recovered. Another miracle. You didn't say a word. Because in the end, doubt is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout, doesn't argue. It just sits beside you, unnoticed by most, like a tired dog at your feet. You may not feed it, but it's always there. And so you live with miracles. You nod and bow and cross yourself when they happen. You light your candles. You touch the relics. You listen to the tales of weeping statues, glowing bones, and saints who walk among the barley fields in the moonlight. You believe mostly. Enough to get by. Enough to sleep at night. Because even if the miracles are false, the hope they offer is real. And that, you think, might be miracle enough. You don't remember deciding to give your child to the church. Not exactly. There wasn't a moment with trumpets and candles where you handed him over like a loaf of bread on the altar. It was slower than that. Like water creeping through a crack in the wall. It just happened. The idea was planted early, when he was still small enough to sleep on your chest. Such a good child, the priest said one day. So quiet, so obedient. A soul like that would do well in God's house. You nodded, unsure what he meant. But the seed was sown. By the time your boy was old enough to feed chickens and trip over his own feet in the fields, the whispers were louder. "You've too many mouths," the neighbour said, not unkindly. "And the monastery needs novices." It was framed as kindness, as opportunity. One less child to clothe. One more soul aimed at heaven. A chance for him to rise above the muck. So you agreed. You said yes without ever really thinking no was an option. The day he left was overcast. Not dramatically, not like a storybook. Just grey. You dressed him in his best tunic, such as it was, and tried not to cry as you tied the belt. He asked if he'd be allowed to keep his wooden toy, the one you carved for him last Yule. You said no, the monks didn't allow toys. He nodded and looked down at the floor. The priest came for him at dawn. He smiled broad and warm, like this was a wedding instead of a goodbye. Your son walked beside him, small and silent, clutching a sack of bread and your wife's handkerchief. You told yourself it was the right thing. You told yourself it was God's will. You told yourself again and again that he would have a better life than you ever could. But it didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like loss. In the monastery, he would rise before the sun. He would chant psalms in a language he didn't understand, eat in silence, and sleep on hard boards with no fire. He would scrub floors, copy texts, and learn to fear sin in 50 new forms. If he was lucky, he'd become a monk. If not, he'd serve until his back broke and his hands curled with age, and then be buried beneath cold stone. You weren't allowed to visit. The church said detachment was holy. That love must be surrendered, like everything else. So you stayed away. But at night, when the wind howled through the cracks in your cottage, you whispered his name. You wondered if he was warm, if he missed your cooking, poor as it was, if he still remembered the lullaby your wife sang when the snow came early. Sometimes, late at night, you wonder what he dreams about now. Does he remember the village square, the feel of bare feet on packed earth, the sting of a switch when he teased the chickens? Or are his dreams filled with Latin verse and the echo of cloisters, dreams shaped by walls too smooth to climb and rules too numerous to question? In the early weeks after he leaves, you half expect to hear his voice outside the door, to see him running across the field, arms flailing, wild-eyed with regret. But it never happens. The church does not return what it claims. It sanctifies, isolates, and reforms. You've seen it before. Boys who left laughing come back years later, with flat voices and downcast eyes, their fingers moving unconsciously over rosary beads, as if afraid to forget. And there's something else that gnaws at you, deep in the marrow of your days. The sense that this wasn't truly your choice, that perhaps it never was. When the priest speaks, you nod. When he smiles, you agree. When he invokes God's will, you lower your gaze and fold your hands. Because the church doesn't need to force you with whips. It only needs to make you believe that saying no would be a sin. You begin to understand, in the quiet hours, how deeply this power runs. It's not just in the altar or the sermon. It's in the silence of every parent who lets go. It's in the hollow space at your table where a child used to sit, and no one dares speak their name. It's in the way your wife folds that one extra tunic and then tucks it away, even though no one will wear it again. The priest visits a week later, smiling as always, speaking softly about God's mercy and how well your son has settled in. A natural, he says, obedient, curious. He seems pleased, as if he's just acquired a new goat with excellent temperament. You nod and murmur a blessing, and pretend it's enough. But a small part of you wants to ask, does he cry? Does he ask about us? Does he wish he'd said goodbye? Instead you offer bread. Thin, crusty, inadequate. The priest takes it without hesitation. That too is the way of things. Seasons pass. Your son's absence becomes part of the rhythm. At times you almost forget what his voice sounded like. Then you'll hear his younger brother mutter something in the same cadence, and your chest will tighten for reasons you don't explain. The village moves on. Another child is given over to the church. This one from the miller's family. A girl this time. People talk. Some say it's a blessing. Others, in hushed tones, say it's convenient. The line between faith and desperation is not always so easy to spot when both wear the same vestments. You sometimes wonder if the saints ever miss their families, or if sainthood requires forgetting where you came from. And then, years later, perhaps 5, perhaps 10, a monk returns to bless the fields. He walks slowly with purpose, a man clearly not made for mud, but determined to walk through it anyway. You recognize the curve of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. But his voice is strange. It rolls like scripture, not like story. He speaks of God's bounty and the price of sin, and you listen, but your mind keeps wandering to a scar on his wrist. You know that scar? You remember when he got it climbing the old tree near the pond. He doesn't acknowledge you. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Or maybe he does, and that's worse. The church says it gave him a life of meaning. You gave him to the church, and neither of you will say aloud what was taken. In time, you stop praying that he'll return. Instead, you pray he's warm. You pray he's safe. You pray that when he lights a candle in the chapel, a small part of the flame remembers your hearth. because no matter what they say about piety, obedience, and the glory of sacrifice, the truth is simpler and quieter. You loved your child. You still do. And even if you would make the same choice again, that doesn't make the ache go away. That is the miracle the church never mentions. Not weeping statues or glowing relics, but the quiet, stubborn love of a peasant who gave up his child and still prays for him in the dark. And despite all the incense, all the scripture, all the ritual and stone, that love might be the most sacred thing you ever held. The sun still rises, but it's no longer the clock you follow. Its path means less to you than the rhythm of bells from the chapel tower, the scent of incense drifting over furrowed fields, and the slow, inevitable crawl of feast days, fasts, and holy weeks that wrap around your life like ivy on stone. You don't think in seasons anymore. You think in liturgical colours. Time, for you, is not marked by the tilt of the earth or the smell of the soil, but by the church's wheel. Advent, Epiphany, Lent, Eastertide, Pentecost, ordinary time, though nothing ever feels very ordinary. It begins when you're small. You learn your numbers by counting the weeks until Christmas. You track the year not by birthdays. Peasant children don't really have those, but by when the priest changes his robes from purple to white to green. Your mother prepares for holidays by hoarding eggs and stretching flour, not because of the equinox, but because the calendar says it's time for joy or penance. Every day is named for something: a martyr who was boiled, a saint who stared at a wall for 20 years, or a virgin who sang hymns until she was set on fire. You know these names by ear, not by book. You can't read, but you know when St. Swithin's Day has come, because that's when the sky opens up and doesn't stop raining for a month. Some days you're allowed meat, others only fish. Sometimes even fish is banned, and you chew hard bread with the reverence normally reserved for relics. If you forget which day is which, someone will remind you. Often loudly and with great enthusiasm, Lent is the worst. 40 days of fasting, fainting, and finding new ways to hate salted turnips. The church calls it purification. You call it involuntary gardening. No meat, no dairy, no fun. You learn to loathe the smell of leeks and the sound of your own stomach. Still, you keep the fast. Everyone does. Because if you break it, and word gets out, the priest might withhold absolution. And if you die without that, well, that's a one-way trip to eternal roastings, complete with pitchforks and screaming angels who are having a very bad day. Easter follows, exploding with roasted lamb, laughter, and the sweet taste of actual fat. You pretend the hunger was worth it. You smile and sing hymns, even though your jaw still aches from gnawing dried peas for a month. Then comes ordinary time, though there's nothing particularly ordinary about it. It's just what the church calls the long, saint-stuffed stretch between major seasons. There's always a new martyr to honour, a new relic to kiss, or a new processional banner to accidentally trip over. The church gives you purpose. Structure. You don't need a clock when you have bells. Morning Mass, midday Angelus, Vespers, Compline. Your body learns to move in rhythm with the chime. You wake, you work, you pray, you sleep. Not because the sun tells you to, but because the bell insists. Even the land obeys. The fields are blessed before planting, cursed by hail in midsummer, and reclaimed by saints in the fall. You sow when the calendar says you may. You reap before Michaelmas, because that's when the archangel walks the fields, and it's considered rude to interrupt him. Your village square isn't marked by market stalls or fountains. It's marked by the church, squat, looming, always damp, with its cracked bell and ever-burning votive smoke that clings to your clothes even outside the chapel. Inside that church, the year lives in colour and cloth, embroidered banners, fading frescoes, and holy days painted on the walls. The calendar is everywhere, etched in glass, carved in wood, stitched into the priest's alb. You kneel beside your neighbours, whispering psalms, uncertain whether the words are Latin or just very confident mumbling. You know when to bow, when to cross yourself, when to fake a cough during a long homily. The feast days are the closest thing you get to a holiday. On St. Martin's Day, you roast a goose. On Candlemas, you light a taper and hope your house doesn't catch fire. On St. Agnes's Eve, the girls place bread under their pillows, hoping to dream of their future husbands, though the results are usually disappointing and a bit damp. And then come the processions. Long, muddy walks behind a statue of the Virgin, or a suspiciously heavy box that supposedly contains a saint's toenail. You march barefoot, holding a candle that drips onto your wrists, singing the same song for the 10th time, because no one dares stop until the priest does. Sometimes it rains. Sometimes the relic falls. Once it caught fire. No one blamed the saint, of course. Only the boy carrying it. He still limps. Marriages are timed by the calendar. Certain weeks are banned, too sacred for dancing. You were married the week after Whitsun, because it was the only time left that year not already occupied by penance or plagues. Even death obeys the calendar. Funerals must be approved. There are days too holy for mourning. Your uncle died on Corpus Christi, and the priest insisted on waiting until Friday to bury him, claiming it was what God wanted. The smell suggested otherwise. Then there are the minor feasts, the ones so obscure they border on surreal. St. Bega's Day, the patron of cold hands. St. Fiacre's Day, protector of hemorrhoids. You celebrate them all because it's not worth arguing, and because the villagers enjoy any excuse to light a candle and eat pie. You live like this because it's safer. To ignore the calendar is to risk your soul. To forget a fast is to risk a scolding. To celebrate on the wrong day is to invite whispered rumours and suspicious glances. The priest claims the calendar brings order. You suppose he's right. Without it, your life would just be mud, hunger, and the occasional bout of shingles. At least now it's holy mud, sanctified hunger, shingles with a feast day. Still, sometimes, on the quiet days, the ones with no saints, no bells, no masses, you feel something strange, a flicker of thought, like a mouse skittering behind your ribs. What would life be like without this calendar? Without this sacred scaffolding? You never let that thought finish. Instead, you rise with the bell, kneel with the crowd, fast when commanded, feast when allowed, because your hours aren't yours. They belong to the saints, to the sacristy, and to the old man who rings the bell, even when no one asks him to. And in the stillness of Vespers, as the smoke curls toward the rafters, and your stomach reminds you it's another fast day, you hope, quietly and obediently, that it's enough. You try, you really do. You rise with the bells, you bow at the altar, you kneel when told and mumble through Latin prayers you don't understand but dare not skip. You cross yourself before meals, after sneezes, and once after a particularly upsetting dream involving Sister Agnes and a very large goat. You are, by all local accounts, a well-behaved Christian peasant. And yet, somehow, you're still doing it wrong. It turns out that following the church isn't about obedience. It's about interpretation. And unfortunately for you, interpretations shift. One day, it's fine to eat eggs during Lent if they've been boiled by your neighbour. The next day, that's heresy, and you're now spiritually adjacent to a leper. You are, in essence, playing a game of eternal salvation where the rules change halfway through, and no one tells you. You remember being young, maybe 10 or 11, when you first noticed the discrepancy. Father Odo preached a homily about the importance of silent prayer. 2 weeks later, Father Elric visited from the abbey and barked at the entire congregation for not praying aloud. He called your village spiritually stagnant and left in a huff. The next day, Father Odo sheepishly explained that we were now to murmur just enough for God to hear, but not enough to distract the saints. That kind of guidance is less than helpful. The Church's position on sin isn't exactly a stationary target either. For most of your life, drinking ale was considered a necessary part of peasant survival. Ale was liquid bread, safer than water, and a minor comfort in a cold, uncaring world. But then came a travelling friar who declared that your daily pint was a gateway to gluttony, and that laughter during meals was a form of pride. Pride, as you well know, leads directly to damnation. So now you sip ale with a frown, and try not to chuckle when your cousin Gervais drops his spoon into the stew pot again. Even your thoughts aren't safe. At first, sin was action-based. Don't steal, don't lie, don't stab your neighbour even if he's really quite stab-worthy. Then came the idea of intentionality. Now, it's not just what you do, it's what you meant to do. That snide thought you had about the bishop's new hat. Sin. That moment of envy when a neighbouring villager's pig gave birth to 7 piglets and yours only managed 2? Also sin. You begin to suspect that your brain is working against your soul. You confess these things, of course, weekly, if not more. But even that process has grown complicated. Some priests ask probing questions, others nod silently, as if reading your sins telepathically through the screen. One priest asked you to confess in order of severity. Another preferred alphabetical. One even told you that sins committed in dreams still counted, which led to an uncomfortable discussion involving Sister Agnes again and a rather unfortunate butter churn. And then there's the matter of indulgences. At first, indulgences were a relief. You could pay a little coin, or donate a chicken, and receive spiritual credit, like tipping your way out of purgatory. But over time, indulgences became a sort of ecclesiastical marketplace. The Church offered them for pilgrimages, for relic donations, even for attending specific masses. You begin to wonder if heaven has a point system, and if so, whether you've accidentally joined the wrong rewards club. What's worse is that different priests tell different stories. Some say purgatory is like a long, smoky waiting room. Others say it's worse than hell because you know relief is coming, just not when. You once asked how long a single sin could trap you there. The priest answered, 1,000 years, maybe more, maybe less. God's time is not our time. Comforting. Your neighbour, old Ethelred, swears he knew a man who returned from the dead after 10 days in purgatory. He came back with a message. Don't eat cheese on Wednesdays. That was it, just that. The priest refused to validate this vision, but now no one eats cheese midweek. You don't either, just in case. The church also seems to rotate its focus every few years. For a while, gluttony was the enemy. Then it was vanity. Cue a rash of sermon-fueled mirror smashing. Then envy, sloth, and finally wrath. You actually liked wrath sermons? They felt oddly cathartic. But now the priests seem to be circling back to gluttony again, and you're starting to feel personally targeted. Occasionally, the higher-ups host councils, enormous meetings where bishops debate the mysteries of heaven with the enthusiasm of men fighting over spoiled milk. After each council, new decrees trickle down. Suddenly, one type of bread is holier than another. Incense must swing left to right now. Saint Philomena is no longer a saint. The fasting hours change again. And woe betide the peasant who doesn't get the update. You once fasted incorrectly during Lent because your village hadn't yet heard about the latest modification from Rome. The priest forgave you, eventually, but not before suggesting that next time you listen more carefully to the wind, which is not a viable strategy. Heresy is also a moving target. One year, a local woman is praised for her piety because she weeps during Mass. The next year, she's called into question for performative holiness and forced to do penance barefoot through a village. A man was once flogged for owning too many books, not because of the content, but because he was a peasant, and books breed questions. You don't even know how to read, but now you're suspicious of anyone who does. And don't get started on saints. Some are removed, others are added, their feast days appear, vanish, or merge. You once celebrated St. Gerbert's Day, only to learn later he never existed. The whole village had lit candles for a man, who turned out to be a mistranslation of the man, who may or may not have been real. You still feel mildly betrayed. You try to keep up. You really do. But it's exhausting. The older you get, the more you notice the contradictions, and the more you learn to stop noticing them. You make peace with the absurdities. You nod when the priest contradicts last week's sermon. You memorize the correct posture for the new Mass version, even though the old one is still scratched into the pews. You don't question anymore. Because the only thing worse than getting it wrong is being seen questioning the system that says what right even is. So you hold your tongue. You give what's asked, you adjust, and adjust again. The path to heaven may be narrow, but it's also winding, overgrown, and full of signs pointing in different directions. And when someone, a child, a new villager, even yourself, asks why, you shrug. You don't know. You just do as the bell says. Because at the end of the day, the church may change its rules, but the final exam stays the same. And you'd rather be over-prepared than surprised. You have always known that in your world, wealth is measured not just in coins, but in contributions to the church. From a young age, you learn that every stray coin, every humble offering, every tired labour paid in kind builds something far greater than a simple meal or a better pair of boots. It builds monuments, grand cathedrals, towering spires, intricately stained glass windows, structures that soar over the village, unattainable and awe-inspiring, symbols of the church's might and the promise of salvation. Yet, for you and the common folk, these colossal creations remain forever out of reach. They are meant for kings, for the exalted few. For you, they remain distant dreams etched in stone and gold. Every week at Mass, you watch as the collection bowl is passed along, its surface worn and dented from years of offerings. You put in what little you have, a coin here, a scrap of food there. The priest gives a nod of approval, and the bag grows heavier day by day. In those moments, you feel both pride and loss. Pride because you are contributing to something that promises eternal glory, loss because you know that each coin is a sacrifice of your meagre means. It's the cost of faith, and you pay it faithfully. The church uses these donations to build marvellous structures, cathedrals and chapels of unimaginable scale. You hear of them in hushed tones at the local tavern, or on the long, dusty roads where traders speak of cities with soaring spires and stained glass that colours the sky in hues not seen on your modest horizon. These monuments are not built for you. They are built for an ideal, a vision of heaven on earth, where the glory of God is manifested in the brilliance of architecture and art. And yet, every time you hand over your coin, you cannot help but feel that your contribution, as humble as it is part of that grand design. You have seen the imposing silhouette of a cathedral in a town far beyond your own, a structure so vast that its shadow falls across entire villages. The walls of that cathedral are said to be adorned with intricate carvings depicting angels, demons, and scenes from biblical history. Every detail is designed to overwhelm, to fill the viewer with both wonder and a deep, abiding humility. Though you know your own village church is modest, its pews creak, its windows are small, its stained glass often more chipped than colourful, you cannot help but marvel at the possibility. You offer your coins, not only because you must, but because you believe that in time, your modest offerings contribute to something greater than yourself. Yet, despite this grand promise, the monuments remain forever beyond your reach. You never step inside that vast cathedral. Its doors are always closed, guarded by centuries of tradition and the unyielding presence of wealth you can only dream of matching. The church builds these monuments not as open houses for every soul, but as places of pilgrimage for the faithful, places to be admired from afar, revered as symbols of divine power and human aspiration. The money you contribute fuels this construction, but the very nature of it keeps you out. The cathedrals are for those deemed worthy, for those whose names are inscribed in the annals of history by virtue of their status. And you, a humble peasant, are meant only to admire them from the shadows. Sometimes you catch a glimpse of one of these grand cathedrals rising in a distant town. Its soaring spires pierce the sky, its bells echoing like the heartbeat of a mighty force. You walk along the dirt roads, feeling the weight of each step, knowing that every inch of that edifice represents a sum of donations many times larger than what you've ever managed to give. It's a monument not only to faith, but to the stark divide between the haves and the have-nots. The very structure is a testament to the power of the church, a power that collects the small hopes of the common folk and transforms them into something majestic and immovable. In the dim light of early morning, you recall how your father once spoke of these great constructions. He told you that when a man gives what little he has to the church, he is not simply donating money, he is investing in the eternal. That every coin is a seed, and in time, that seed will grow into a towering testament to devotion. Yet, in the same breath, he warned that the church's monuments are also a reminder of the vast gulf between those who give and those who build. It is said that while the church's spires reach toward the heavens, the souls of the poor remain trapped in the mud. You understand this on a level that defies explanation. A quiet resignation that no matter how many coins you offer, the doors of the grand cathedrals will never swing wide enough for you. Every donation, every whispered prayer over a coin dropped into a wooden cup, feeds into this cycle. The church collects, builds, and then guards its treasures jealously behind thick stone walls. These structures, adorned with gold leaf and intricate sculptures, become symbols of divine favour. Yet as you watch from afar, you realise that the very splendour is also a chain, binding the common folk to a system that values wealth and obedience over genuine fellowship. Sometimes you wonder if the church builds these monuments not solely to honour God, but to keep the people in line. A towering cathedral, majestic and inaccessible, reminds you that while you may work the land and pay your tithe, you are forever a subject, not of a king, but of an institution, one that, for all its miracles, remains distant and unyielding. You see it in the way the priest speaks, his voice calm and measured, as though every word is designed to reassure those who dare not dream of more. And yet, there is a strange comfort in the tradition. The church calendar marks the days in a way that creates order out of chaos. Even if its grand monuments are forever beyond your grasp, the structure it provides is a constant in a world full of uncertainty. You know when Lent begins. You know exactly how many days until Easter. You understand the solemn importance of feast days, even if you cannot partake fully because your stomach is too often empty. The rhythm of sacred time is as real to you as the changing of the seasons, though it obeys a different logic. You attend Mass, not just for salvation, but for the assurance that time is on your side. The bell tolls, and its sound is a reminder that you belong to something larger, that though your coin is small, it is part of a grand, unending ledger that stretches into eternity. The church builds its monuments not only on stone and gold, but on the invisible architecture of belief, the trust that even the smallest offering matters. In your daily life, you see the contrast. You're often in the fields from dawn until dusk, your hands calloused and your face weathered by sun and wind. And yet, each Sunday, you walk the short distance to the chapel, your few coins held tightly in your hand, ready to be offered. You understand that your labour and your money build not just your own sustenance, but contribute to the eternal. It is a bittersweet bargain. You give, and in return, you receive nothing tangible in your lifetime. The grand structures of the church rise far above you, their doors sealed to all but the highest ranks, while you continue to live under the same open sky. The vast looming cathedrals that you see in distant towns are both a promise and a prison. They promise a connection to something divine, a glimpse of everlasting glory. Yet they remain locked behind doors that never swing open for you. The church's monuments are built with funds collected from every village, every peasant's meagre coin offering, and every whispered prayer of hope. But they are reserved for the pious elite, the crowned, the noble, or those whose names are etched in hallowed records. And so, while you contribute every Sunday, your place in those grand halls is never assured. You learn as you grow that the calendar is sacrosanct. It is not nature's measure, but the church's design. The cycle of feasts and fasts, of holy days and penitential seasons, governs your life more surely than the rising and setting of the sun. Even if the sun still climbs the sky each day, your true measure of time is the liturgy. Advent brings the promise of a Saviour. Lent brings the pang of sacrifice. And Easter, even if you can hardly taste the sweetness behind the bitterness of your daily bread, brings a renewal that you cling to with desperate hope. The calendar defines fate. It dictates when you can enjoy a simple meal, when you must endure more arduous fasting, and when you are permitted to celebrate, however briefly. It also decides how you contribute to the church's coffers. Your every coin, your every scrap of extra food, collected day after day, eventually forms the foundation of something grand and unreachable. The grand cathedrals, the imposing chapels, the glittering relics in sealed boxes. They are all constructed from the humble offerings of peasants like you. And though these monuments are splendid to behold, they remain forever out of reach for you. You see their towering spires from afar, hear their bells ringing in distant towns, and marvel at the intricate stonework that tells stories of saints and sinners. But you know that the Church, despite building these heavens on earth, will never allow you to step inside them. They are symbols of divine favour, of the wealth and power that separates the few from the many. Your donations, though given with trembling hands and a hopeful heart, are like water in a sieve, passing through and building walls that you may only see but never cross. In the quiet moments between work and prayer, you sometimes wonder about the price of faith. It is measured not in pounds or pence, but in the sacrifice of that which is most dear to you. Your child, your labour, your very hope. And yet you persevere, because there is no other way to live. To give is to belong to something greater than yourself, even if that something is as remote and as cold as the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral in a distant city. In the end, your life is marked by this perpetual exchange. Every coin you donate, every tithe you scrape together, contributes to the Church's vast, unyielding construction, a reminder of both their benevolence and their distance. You give out of necessity and duty, with a quiet resignation that your contribution is significant only in the eyes of those who build and not of those who labour. And so, each Sunday, you walk the familiar path to the chapel, your head bowed, your hands clasped, knowing full well that the calendar dictates not the cycle of the seasons alone, but the measure of your life. The Church's grand monuments may never open their doors to you, but they continue to rise, testament to a belief that, for all its promise of salvation, remains forever out of reach for the common soul. It begins with a cough. Not much at first, just a dry rattle in your chest that doesn't go away. Maybe it's the cold stone floor or the damp straw mattress. Maybe it's just age, finally creeping into your ribs. Either way, you start coughing more often and longer, until it wakes your wife, until the children listen at the door, until the priest is called. He doesn't say you're dying, not outright. He calls it the season of reflection, which is a church word for get your soul in order. You lie on your bed, thin as a spindle and twice as brittle. The thatch roof above you leaks in 3 places, but no one bothers to patch it now. Rainwater beads on the edge of your wooden bowl, collecting in time with the drip behind your left shoulder. There's no fire. You're too weak to gather wood, and no one wants to leave your side. Not when the coughing's grown that deep. Your wife, who once carried 2 buckets up the hill without pausing, now holds your hand like it's made of glass. Your son kneels by the bed, lips moving soundlessly through a prayer he learned by rote, too young to understand, and too scared not to say it. The priest arrives at dusk. He smells of wet wool and candle smoke, and his face has the soft exhaustion of someone who's seen too many last breaths this week. He lights a small taper and places it beside you. The candlelight flickers against the wall, dancing across the soot stains and cobwebs like a final benediction. It's time for the last rites. He begins with the litany of saints. You try to mouth the names, but your tongue doesn't keep up. Augustine, Benedict, Agnes, Lawrence, Cecilia. You recognize them like distant cousins at a feast. Vaguely familiar, deeply out of reach. He anoints your forehead, your hands, your chest. The oil smells like bitter herbs. He murmurs Latin words meant to open the gates of heaven. You focus hard, hoping God is listening, and that he's not in one of his more vengeful moods. Outside, the village goes on. A cow moans somewhere. A child cries. Someone's hammering a cartwheel with unnecessary enthusiasm. Life continues just far enough away that it hurts. The priest offers you a crucifix. You clutch it like a lifeline, knuckles white against the worn wood. You've touched this shape 1,000 times. In church, in prayer, in fear. Now you cling to it as if it might drag your soul upward through sheer familiarity. He whispers a final blessing and closes his book. There's nothing more he can do. And now, you wait. You'd think dying would be dramatic. Trumpets of the soul. Angel choirs. Something to mark the moment. But really, it's just more silence. A long, slow quiet that settles over your bones like dust. You drift. Memories rise like smoke. You see your mother lighting a candle on All Saints' Day. You see your child's baptism. The priest fumbling the holy water while your baby wailed like a war horn. You see yourself years ago, standing barefoot in the mud outside the church, staring up at the stained glass window of Christ in judgment, wondering whether you'd be found wanting. You think of sins, not the grand ones. You've never killed, never blasphemed, out loud, never stolen anything worth locking away. But still, they add up. The lie you told about your neighbour's barley yield, the meat you ate during Lent, just once, but greedily. The thoughts you had during sermons when your mind wandered somewhere it shouldn't. You confess them. You think. Most of them. Probably. You think of purgatory. A place between places. A long hall of smoke and regret where your soul gets scrubbed like laundry before it can meet the divine. Some say it lasts days. Some say centuries. One man claimed to have returned from it, just briefly, and said it smelled like burning hair and wet stone. You hope he was exaggerating. Your wife presses a cloth to your forehead. It's damp. Her hand lingers a moment too long. Not because she's trying to comfort you, but because she's afraid to let go. The priest steps outside to tell the village. You hear his voice, low and practiced, saying words you can't quite catch. You know the ritual by heart anyway. Someone will toll the bell. The women will begin baking the burial loaves. A grave will be dug, not too deep. The ground is hard this time of year. There will be a mass, maybe 2, if your wife can afford the second. Your name will be said aloud, then folded into silence. A life summarized in 4 syllables and 1 candle. If you're lucky, someone will remember to light another for your soul next year. You wonder what death looks like. The church says it's a passage, like stepping through a veil. There's judgment, of course. A great book, a balance. St. Peter, possibly, though no one's quite sure what he actually does. You imagine your soul as a flickering wisp, standing in line behind 1,000 others, all waiting to be sorted like sacks of barley. What if you don't make it? What if the weight of your sins, however small, tips the scales the wrong way? What if your final confession wasn't complete? What if you died thinking of the wrong thing? They say your last thought matters, that whatever fills your heart in that final breath echoes into eternity. You try to think of Christ, of mercy, of golden gates and angels with wings made of light, but it's hard. Your thoughts keep drifting to your wife's face, to the warmth of her hand, to the way the fire crackles when she's not watching it. You hope that counts. A chicken clucks outside. Somewhere in the village, someone laughs. Not cruelly, just the normal sound of someone living. You wonder if they'll quiet down when they hear the bell. You wonder if they'll stop for a moment, say a prayer, or if they'll just keep walking, kicking dust and muttering about the weather. The church says you are not gone, just past. That prayers can still help you, that masses can still reach you, that the living owe the dead a duty. You hope that's true, because otherwise it's just dirt. Your final moment doesn't come with fanfare. There's no light, no trumpet, no angel. Just breathe, then no breath. A silence that deepens. The priest will return soon. He'll close your eyes, even if they're already shut. He'll cover your body with a cloth and begin the prayers of commendation. Go forth, O Christian soul, he will say, and everyone will nod, as if they understand where you're going. Your family will cry. Not all at once, some tears are delayed. Your youngest might not cry until the burial, when they see the hole in the earth. You'll be buried with a cross, a simple wooden one. There's no money for stone. Maybe someone will mark it with a name, maybe just a carved X. In time, grass will grow over it. Children will run across the hill. Some might step right over you without knowing. You don't mind, because deep down, you've done what you could. You lived quietly. You obeyed the bells. You feared the right things. You hoped, even when it felt silly, that it all meant something. And in your final moment, when everything else fell away, you held the cross and whispered the only words you knew for sure. Have mercy.